Hi, my name is Michael Chikeen. The smartest people I've met have one common belief that us silly humans really don't know much. For example, we still don't know why planes stay in the air, or how Tylenol or even gravity works. Yeah, gravity. Look it up. In today's distracted, clickbait, misinformation age, I wish we could all be less certain, more humble, and a lot more curious. Admittedly, I've been known to struggle with all three. So, no more, no less, this show is my attempt to be that change. Thanks for joining me, and here we go. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to No More, No Less. I'm your host, Michael Chikeen, and I'm excited because today in the studio with me, I have Dr. Gurpreet Padda, a graduate of the University of Missouri, Kansas City Medical School. He's a board-certified physician who specializes in pain management, addiction, and focuses also on metabolic inflammation. Today, we're going to start on what the medical establishment is getting wrong with addiction and how the opioid epidemic might be a loneliness epidemic where the symptom is drug addiction. So there's lots to unpack. So, Dr. Padda, welcome to the show.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. I guess let's start, as I mentioned before, at the top of the mountain and see how deep we get. So what do you think we're generally getting wrong about addiction these days?
There's a couple of factors, but the main factor is that we treat addiction as if it's a pure biological issue. We're treating it as if we expose a patient to a drug and voila, they're addicted. And this is on the basis of some early rat studies that were done where they took rats, they put them in a large container, and they took a rat and they dropped it in there, and they offered the rat on one side of the container water, and on the other side they offered it a narcotic. And lo and behold, the rat came running over to the water, drank some water, went over to the narcotic, and realized it was getting something of benefit. It made it feel different. And so it kept drinking the narcotic until it died. And so our basis of theory is rats, humans, exposed to narcotics will continue to use until they die. And that's simply not true. We had this presupposition during the Nixon era when we were closing up the Vietnam War. And we had about 20-25% of members in the armed forces who were using heroin in Vietnam. And Nixon was terrified that when these people came back to the United States, when they were repatriated, they would come back and we'd have zombies in the street. 25% of people would be abusing drugs because obviously they'd been exposed to drugs there, and a quarter of them were using, or more. Some have speculated 40%, but we know it was at least a quarter. And so when he was repatriating them, he was convinced that these people were going to come back, and they didn't know how to handle that. And that's one of the things that delayed the closure of the war, is because they were afraid of all these zombies that were drug addicted. Right. Lo and behold, we repatriated these people, and only 5% of them were addicted. And that's rather unusual because that's the standard rate in the general population. So how is it that you took 25 to 40% of the people abusing and using drugs of significant strength, and they're not addicted when they come back to the U.S., but they were addicted there? And so that posits the question. It's not necessarily that you have availability to the drug. There's more to it. I mean, certainly you have to have availability to the drug to have an addiction to the drug, right. But that doesn't mean that that's what you're doing. So they repeated the rat study, and this is the rat study that people don't look at. They did the rat study, and they dropped a rat into a cage. They made the cage bigger, and now they put some toys in there for it to play with, and they put other rats for it to play with. And they gave the rat the opportunity, narcotic or water. The rat drank the water, drank the narcotic, realized it had friends, quit drinking the narcotic water, ignored it completely, drank the water as it needed, and played with its friends and had sex and ran around mazes and never overdosed, never died. So what that tells you is that it's the social interaction and the integrity of that social interaction that determines the likelihood that that rat is going to try and consume narcotics in a long-term manner. And we see that when I look at patients, and I recognize that we have an international audience that's listening, relatively speaking. And so when I look at the urban core, which is where I practice, we see people standing on street corners in group, but they're really standing in their own silo. And they're out there and they're drug addicted, but they're standing next to each other, but they're not interacting with each other. They just happen to be adjacent suppliers or people that they kind of know, and they mill around, but there's really no tangible linkage between one person or another. And so I think that that's something that we completely have overlooked in addiction, is that it's really the absence of connection to other human beings that promotes the hedonic drive to get out of your head.
Right. There's even things I've been reading recently about how this proliferation of the ideology or the philosophy of Stoicism is also stoking loneliness, because it's telling people that they should detach from their feelings, that they should kind of separate themselves from the world as part of a philosophy. And I think sometimes it seems like people end up more disconnected and isolated instead of kind of accepting how they're feeling. Instead, I think I'm of the mind that if we kind of ignore the feelings we have, it's still going to run the show. We just don't have access to what it's doing, and we end up kind of reactionarily making these decisions. So how would you recommend, like, I guess I believe you run a pain clinic. So what sort of protocols are there in place if people are searching for this connection or some sort of help, and it's manifesting in pain, for example?
Yeah, so let's go back to that Stoicism concept first, and then I'll mention my thoughts on this. I think that with our modern culture of comfort seeking, we need a little bit of Stoicism. I'm not saying that we need some robust, go out and cut your own liver out and patch it up and do what you got to do. That's not what I'm talking about. But I do believe that because we have such an easy access to things that produce dopamine for us, that produce comfort and produce an easy access to food, it's an easy access to alcohol, an easy access to many of the things that dopamine drive us. We have it right on our phone. We have TikTok, and right. We have access to social media, and all of these things cause a dopaminergic release. In fact, TikTok is designed to hijack our dopamine system.
Right.
And so we do need some degree of ability to separate from the immediate desire to demand dopamine for our brain. That's what differentiates us from other primates, is that we can plan logistically and accept some degree of discomfort now for a greater reward later. And in fact, if you look at habit formation, almost all habits that reward you in the present punish you in the future. And almost all habits that punish you now, that you suffer a little bit now, reward you to a greater extent later. And so that's the basis of Stoicism. But people take it too far, and then they become punitive, and they become self-punitive, and that doesn't benefit them either. So that's something that I kind of have to balance act with regards to the easy access to dopamine stimulation. People have access to online porn, and all of a sudden they're watching online porn, which causes immediate dopamine release. But then the long-term effect of that is that they can never connect with another human being, because what they're visualizing and what they're consuming is a greater dopaminergic release than they're ever going to get with all of the heartache and the tragedy of other human beings. And so they become inwardly focused and ignore society even more. Same thing with easy access to sugar. It used to be that if you wanted honey, you had to climb a mountain 2,000 feet up and harvest, in Burma, and harvest the honey off of the inside of a cave where you had to fight off these bees, and you had to use smoke, and it took you forever, and you weren't going to get honey in a refined way. Right. So that's the thought behind it. With regards to pain,
if I can just stay on the stoicism moment for 1 second more, because I can't find anything that you said that I would disagree with, especially how easy access we have to dopamine from our phones, like you said, to food, all sorts of things. I think where maybe it seems your definition of stoicism is definitely more generous than mine, because from all the books I've read on it and all the things I've seen, online through different entrepreneur communities, it seems like it's not really a process of separating people from their desires for like dopaminergic hits. It seems like it's more separating people from their negative emotions, and that's where it says like, picture the worst thing that can happen, and then go from there. So it's kind of taking us out of the moment that we just feel bad about something in the moment, and saying, okay, well, let's find a way to not accept how we feel in the moment. So that's where I was seeing a little bit of a difference, but I totally agree with what you said as far as how, like, we're in such an area of comfort. Like, you're seldom more than an arm's length away from getting your phone, your TV remote, your a dating app or food or whatever. Like, and I would imagine in the US with the obesity epidemic that you see a lot of people self-medicating with food. Is that accurate?
Yeah, they self-medicate. And the food companies know that. I mean, that's the thing. The food is made hyper addictive. There's a book called The Dorito Effect, in which they use logarithmic changes in the flavoring in the Dorito bag. So there's at least 12 to 17 varieties of flavor in a bag of Doritos. They're not like giving you a bag of Doritos with one flavor. What they've done is they know that you have sensory specific satiety. And each time they titillate your taste bud with a slightly different flavor that appearingly looks the same, but it revitalizes your tongue, and your tongue goes, hey, I'm hungrier than I was because I just had a different flavor profile, and I never got satiety for this flavor profile. And then all of a sudden, you've got another Dorito coming, and that has a slightly different flavor profile. And you don't realize that they're doing that.
Wow.
And they're spending a lot of money doing it. It's to the point where, I'll give you another example. So this is an agricultural phenomenon. When we got rid of cigarettes in the United States, a lot of those people, or when we started to decrease the use of cigarettes in the United States through lawsuits, a lot of the cigarette scientists moved over to the food world. And so they already brought with them the ability to understand how addiction works. And so they understood the concept of satiety. They understood all of these other things, and they applied it to food. Now, let me give you a concrete example that doesn't make sense at first, because you go, why would they do that? So let's talk about high fructose corn syrup and soda, sugar-sweetened beverages. So normally, if you have table sugar, 50% of table sugar is a disaccharide, so 50% of table sugar is glucose, and 50% of table sugar is fructose. It seems reasonable. Glucose is the thing that we normally think about as sugar, but table sugar is both. It's fructose and glucose. We historically think that people might overdose or overuse sugar. And we know in rat studies that rats prefer sugar over cocaine as in terms of water. And we know that rats will preferentially take cocaine, will take the sugar before they'll take the cocaine. They will deplete the sugar bottle, and then as a secondary resort will go over to the cocaine. They like the sugar much better. Even though... And we know that the dopamine release in their brain is greater for the sugars than it is for the cocaine. We've done studies on the nucleus accumbens. And you can measure the dopamine in their brain in the release, and you can look at their behavior, and you can see that these rats like this sugar better than cocaine. In fact, it's up there with them liking other things like, sex and things of that nature, and methamphetamine. And there are different scales of drug. So we know that they like that. Now, let's go back to sugar-sweetened beverages. If I was making a sugar-sweetened beverage, I would use a sugar. I'd put it in there, and it'd be 50% fructose and 50% glucose. But that's not what it is. They use sugar-sweetened beverages, and they use high fructose corn syrup. Okay, well, you might think they use high fructose corn syrup because there's a subsidy in the United States to produce corn, and maybe they're getting that high fructose corn syrup cheaper. So that should be 55% fructose, 45% glucose. Well, that's what it is, right? No, that's not what it is. They're spending extra money taking the high fructose corn syrup, refining it even further, and getting 60 to 65% fructose. Why are they doing that? Why are they spending extra money to hyper refine it so it's even more fructose? The reason why is there's a greater dopamine release. And what happens is when you get up to 60-65% fructose, it's the equivalent of smoking cigarettes. You Jones for it 15 minutes after you finished it. And you go, I got another sip of soda. We've supersized the sodas. We've made them gigantic. So we're constantly self-dosing this dopamine release. And then we're looking around for our next dopamine hit because all of a sudden we've jonesed. We've gone into withdrawal from a fructose withdrawal, and which was activating our dopamine. And the companies know that. So they've spent extra money just to give us that extra fructose. A similar thing with vegetable oil. There's compounds in vegetable oil that break down and they activate the anandamide system. And so we know that vegetable oil, when it's been oxidized with fluorescent light, when it's been oxidized by heating, breaks down, and it creates a polyunsaturated fatty acid that is highly oxidized and very toxic to our cells. We know that it's more addictive. And that's why when you look at processed food in the United States, it has a ton of sugar, especially fructose, and it has a ton of vegetable oil. The two of those together, though, cause problems, and they cause severe insulin resistance, and they cause diabetes. And that's why we have this obesity epidemic.
See, I'm really curious your opinion as an American, and as I mentioned before the show, so I was born and raised in Canada outside Toronto, and now I live full time in Southern Europe, and there are a lot more strict regulations around food quality and safety in the countries I've been in, aside from the U.S. And so I wonder, how could, like, even policy-wise, if there's a large consensus in the in the healthcare community and the scientific community of how all of these things are a detriment to society and to the citizenry, and so how do you create policy? Because in sort of the environment in the U.S., there's kind of anti-regulation on a number of aspects, whereas I think a lot of the population would like kind of sensible regulation around protecting the food supply and protecting from things that are kind of, that we know, hijacking the brain to the detriment of the people. So how would you, because obviously, as you communicated, you can tell you think this is a problem for sure. So how do you create an environment in which we don't let the corporate overlords dictate whatever they can do with the crops, with the food, with everything that people are ingesting, which I think is arguably one of the more important things in society, in like food, air, and water. So how would you recommend that you can bridge that gap, for example?
Well, I think you have to look at the incentives. So the concept is out of Mussolini. Mussolini talked about corporatism. It's when the private corporations and the government have aligned interests. That's way worse than any fascism could be. And what's happened in the United States and the rest of the world, in a lot of areas, the corporations hold a great deal of sway over government. And what happens is there's a rotation between the corporations, the private corporations, and governmental officials. Most of the policy decisions are made by corporations that then feed the government that policy decision. If you look at the Food and Drug Administration, if you look at the dietary guidelines, most of these people that are producing the dietary guidelines in the United States are heavily corporately funded. If you look at the Food and Drug Administration, you look at the drugs that are coming out of the FDA that are approved, they're getting significant corporate funding. And that sways the decision of what's right and wrong. And the problem is that a lot of the medical associations are also captured. For example, the nutrition associations are funded heavily by the cereal companies in the United States. So it's highly unlikely that you're going to all of a sudden one day be a nutritionist going to the national meeting and the next day come out and say, I don't think you should eat cereal because it's got too much grain in it. It's more likely that you've been heavily marketed and you just don't realize it, and you think that all of these snack foods are healthy. That's why in the United States, people are targeted to have 3 meals a day, and they end up with 3 meals and 5 snacks. And so there's a constant feeding that occurs, and that's the other cause for obesity. It's because we have a constant influx of nutrients, or at least we have a constant influx of carbohydrates and vegetable oils that are probably non-nutritive. And we constantly consume them, and because we don't move much, because we don't really have activity, we never deplete the glycogen out of our livers. We people in the United States eat from the time they get up in the morning to the time they go to bed. And so we never have an opportunity to reduce the glycogen reserve that was in our liver. It was 2,000 kilocalories, about 500 grams of glycogen. And we've never gotten rid of it all day. And then the next day we stack on top of that, and that becomes fat. And the next day we stack on top of that, and that becomes fat. And so we can only hold about 2,000 to 3,000 calories in glycogen. And if we never depleted it, everything else is going straight to fat. And all of a sudden we're insulin resistant, and we're getting more and more viscerogenic obesity. And before we know it, we're diabetic. And that's one of the issues. So it's that alignment of corporate interests with government that is probably one of the largest drivers of this kind of malfeasance against society. I tell you that alignment is very similar to most of the drug industries that we've got. It's a combination of big ag and big pharma aligned with big government. And I don't think that physicians are immune to that stupidity. I mean, Ansel Keys, who is one of the folks that promoted vegetable oil consumption, was paid off by the vegetable oil companies. And so that's how we have heart-healthy vegetable oil. There's nothing heart-healthy about it. They paid to get that symbology on their product. And so that's because there's an alignment of that corporate interest.
Right. It seems like it's this repetitive one-act play in a lot of countries, but obviously it's very evident in the U.S. where, someone will just pay someone off in the industry, and all of a sudden it's this cycle that will take decades to undo if it does get undone. I guess. So let's say before we move on to the pharmacological issues, I'd love to know on the food subject. So let's say tomorrow you were branded Dr. Gurpreet Padda, Health Czar of the United States, and you could create sweeping legislation. What would be policy that you think would be helpful to kind of undo this incestuous relationship between government and the food, or sorry, corporations and the food supply?
I think that the number one issue is that we have this back and forth between these governmental officials and the corporate officials. I think that once they leave the government, they end up in the corporation, and you're not going to bite the hand that feeds you in the future. So I don't think that should happen. I think you leave the government, you can't go back and lobby working for a private entity back to your governmental colleagues. Right. I think that's a big issue. It's the same thing with attorneys. It's the same thing with people in government. They don't make that much money in government, except the very, very top parts of government. The individuals usually don't make that much money as in terms of rank and file. Mm-hmm. Now, the very, very top make a ton of money, and the very, very top, the Congress and the Senate, are immune to self-dealing laws. So they can invest in stock, they can invest in things that they have private knowledge of. You and I did that, we'd be in federal penitentiary. But when they do that, they make millions, and they live on a $100,000 salary, but have $100 million of money. So they have a different form of self-dealing. But what I would do is I would encourage us to not allow that self-dealing and get away from that. I think that's factor one. Factor two is to actually, when we're doing reviews, to be more forthright. See, we've had several dietary reviews, and most of the world follows after the U.S. does their dietary review. And so we have this food pyramid, and the food pyramid, the thing that we're supposed to consume the most of is grains, and we're supposed to consume a ton of carbohydrate. But people misapply that, and they don't understand. One, it's not meant for people that are sick. Well, in the United States, only 7% of the U.S. population is metabolically healthy. So that food pyramid that's been designed as a dietary guideline is not right for 93% of the human population in the United States. It's only meant for 7%. And that 7% won't follow that food pyramid because they're like, that'll make you sick. So I don't think it's really designed for anybody. And when the base of the food pyramid is heavy in carbohydrate, we have a problem. And I mean, certainly you can figure out ways to do it if you have enough physical activity, if you have other things that are working for you. So that's issue one. Issue two is you need transparency. You need absolute transparency, and you need to be able to have a punitive method for downstream effect. So let's say that I do something stupid as an individual. I could get sued, and I could have to suffer the consequences of it. Let's say you're a governmental official. You know that you're doing something stupid. You're immune from lawsuit. No one can do anything to you. Even though you acted as an individual, made decisions as an individual, you did it under the cover of governmental law, and all of a sudden you're immune from prosecution because you did it under the guise that this was for governmental benefit.
Right. No accountability.
Yeah, there's no accountability, and that's a problem, and that's not right. And unfortunately, that's what we have. And so that's another factor that's significant. We have all the information. I mean, we all know if you read these studies. I mean, everybody knows the right answer, but nobody applies the right answer because they have motivations that are obscured, and they don't have to take any responsibility for their action long term.
Right. Yeah, and it's hard to get a good dissemination of information. Like, even if we have, like, as we've had the correct information of how toxic and poisonous cigarettes are for so many different reasons, but if you have an addictive substance that you're using, it's not so easy to just separate yourself from that substance because you read a pamphlet that tells you that cigarette smoking kills. So I can understand how it's difficult for both the government agencies, for health experts to disseminate this information, and how painful it must be for physicians to be seeing clients that are doing so much damage to themselves when you're trying to produce, a good quality of care. And I think that's a good way to lead into what we spoke about briefly before we started this call. You mentioned this new drug that's out there, and what's the name of it again?
Xylazine. It's being mixed into most of the fentanyl that we're seeing on the street. We're seeing a lot of fentanyl. It's probably 3/4 of our overdose deaths, and that's recently crazy. About 90% of the fentanyl that's coming in is cross-contaminated with this animal tranquilizer. It's called Xylazine. We don't have a good way to test for it in the street. The problem with Xylazine is it extends the duration of fentanyl. That's one factor. It works adjacent to fentanyl. It works on a different receptor, so it makes fentanyl last longer. But the other problem is it's not reversible. So I can't give you Narcan, which I could if you had overdosed on fentanyl. I could give you an antagonist and turn it off and possibly rescue you. Well, with Xylazine, I can't do that because we don't have an antagonist for Xylazine. And the thing is that most people don't even recognize that they're getting Xylazine. And in fact, the majority of fentanyl overdosages are not because people are intentionally overdosing on fentanyl. There's two factors here. One is they're getting it in something that they don't know. So they're buying XYZ drug. They think they're buying marijuana, and some idiot street dealer has cut their marijuana or their cocaine or their methamphetamine with fentanyl. And because micrograms kill, and because they don't practice good manufacturing, and they're not testing their product, and they don't know what the concentration is, they're inadvertently causing overdosages, and people are inadvertently overdosing and dying. And that's an issue.
How can you even cut marijuana, for example, which is one of the few drugs that I am familiar with, that like with something like fentanyl, like wouldn't you be able to see the?
No, it's tiny. It's particles. So you can aerosolize or gas fentanyl very easily. So I don't know if you recall, but there was a situation in the Soviet Union. This was 10, 15 years ago. And they had a bunch of rebels that took over a movie theater. And the Soviets were, they didn't want to attack the movie theater directly because they were convinced that the Chechen rebels would kill the people that were there. So they decided to drop a fentanyl bomb. And they thought, well, what will happen is these people go to sleep. And then we'll walk in and we'll take care of it. And we'll get people to wake up and it'll be fine. So they dropped this fentanyl bomb in. And they killed almost everybody because the problem was that it aerosolizes so quickly. It becomes a gas, and it's a weapon of mass destruction. It's like mustard gas. And so these people inhale it, and what they do is they get stiff chest syndrome, and so they can't breathe. And they've been overdosed on opiate. So it doesn't take much to do. It takes like the equivalent of if you looked at a grain of salt. A grain of salt. That's all it would take to kill you. If you mix that into a grain of salt. 1 grain.
Hold on. Okay, that just blew the back of my head off. So how if that's the amount that it would take a fentanyl to kill someone, how are they even administering this in hospitals where it is necessary? Like how do you you have to atomize it? I don't understand.
No. So in hospitals, what we get is we get carpules, so the hospital fentanyl that we're getting has 200 micrograms in it, and it's diluted. And remember, we're doing this under anesthesia. So I'm going to give you low-dose fentanyl for pain, but I'm fully monitoring you. I've got a pulse oximeter on you. I've got your EKG monitored, and I'm an anesthesiologist. So I'm going to give you some fentanyl, and I might be putting you to sleep, and I might be intubating you. And the fentanyl will wear off over a certain time period. And if you do get stiff chest, I can give you a muscle relaxant to stop that stiff chest. So you're fully monitored. You do the same thing on the street. And first of all, you don't know whether you're getting 200 micrograms or 20,000 micrograms. So we just had a seizure of fentanyl 2 days ago in the United States. And it came through our southern border. And it was about a small quantity. I mean, like a box, like a small shoebox size of fentanyl. There was enough fentanyl in there to kill 30 million people.
What?
Yeah. And so it takes very little to kill. And that's the problem. And so the thing is, when we're manufacturing the fentanyl down in Mexico, when they're manufacturing it, because they're getting the reagents out of China. The reagents are manufactured in China. They're translocated to Mexico. They're mixed in Mexico.
Well, what is a reagent?
The reagent is the base of what you make fentanyl out of. There's a variety of organic compounds that you can make fentanyl from. Fentanyl is a synthetic opiate. So as opposed to heroin, which is a non-synthetic opiate, it comes from the poppy plant. And it's super refined poppy. It's super refined morphine. Fentanyl is totally synthetic. You chemically manufacture it, and you go through a base reaction to do it. So it takes chemicals to do that. Those chemicals are readily available in China. And so those chemicals are manufactured in China right now and then shipped to Mexico. It's finished in Mexico. You might ask yourself, why isn't it finished in China? They had a problem. They were manufacturing fentanyl in China. But the problem was that during a manufacturing process, part of it got aerosolized and gassed, and thousands of people died.
Thousands.
And so China put an end to that manufacturing there. They said, if we catch you manufacturing fentanyl, we're going to execute you. So instead, they just manufacture the reagents, export the reagents, and then the Mexican drug gangs assemble it and then bring it to the United States.
But I guess the question is, if it needs so much monitoring, even in a medical clinical environment, for, like you said, stiff chest syndrome and all these other negative reactions that can happen, why are we even using it? Like, why is like morphine not good enough that we've had to level up this sort of pain medication, which seems to be off the charts of all the other problems that it creates?
Well, I mean, it's the nature of animals. It's the nature of primates. So we start off, we start off using simple things, and we start off using fermented fruit, and we like that little bit of low alcohol in it. And then we refine the fermented fruit into spirits, and we like that. And then we start off with poppy, and we like that. And then we start to refine that into morphine, and we refine that into heroin. And so there's a natural trajectory of dose escalation that happens over generations. So our next generative refinement has been to the synthetics. The problem is that our street dealers have not caught up to the fact that there's a lot of chemistry, pH, pKa, concentrations, concentration gradients. They have not caught up to the fact that if you heat the product, you get other compounds other than fentanyl. You can get sufentanil, alifentanil, you can get isotazine. There's a whole host of other compounds that are far stronger than fentanyl, and you'll start seeing those. And so everybody wants to have the drug that gets them out of their heads. It's a natural tendency for primates. You'll see elephants go find fermented fruit so they can get drunk, so they can get out of their heads. It's an inherent drive in all primates to get closer to God and to get closer to these ethereal concepts. And so people have been forever using marijuana to get out of their heads. And so that's just the natural trajectory. The more availability you have for crazy substances, the more likely you are to use them.
Right. Do you think we'd be better off without fentanyl in general if we just banish it from the earth? Or like, is there clinical...
There's no banishing this. There's no banishing
No,
this
I know, but I mean theoretically, like, is there a clinical use
Yeah.
that validates that we actually really need it, or it's just because we've created it, now we're using it?
No. There's a clinical use. We've had fentanyl for a long time. I mean, we've used fentanyl forever. It just is so cheap to manufacture. We've had fentanyl for, like 25 years, 30 years. And we use it in anesthesia all the time. When we do cardiac operations, that's what we use. Okay. Because we can give it to you IV, and when I do pediatric heart, liver, lung transplant, that's what I use. It's one of my base anesthesia concepts. It's only when it becomes unregulated do we have a problem.
Right, because I thought it was mainly strictly just for pain management. I didn't know that you could use it to anesthetize somebody.
Yeah, no, it's the primary goal of fentanyl is actually anesthesia. That's where we use it. And then we started using it in complex cases that had cancer and where people were resistant to morphine. So if you're dying of a head and neck tumor, and we make you more comfortable, we can use fentanyl because you might be able to use that as a lollipop because you can't swallow. You can put it on your tongue and you can absorb it. So there are some indications if you have a burn all over your body and you're getting you're getting skin grafts or you're getting changes of your dressings, we use fentanyl in combination with other meds to make it comfortable. It's a clean drug. It's only when you subvert it to the street that it becomes unregulated. If there was some magic way to legislate people stop using fentanyl, it'd be great. But that's not, drug dealers don't listen to legislation because they're drug dealers. Right. And so if there's an available opportunity to use a medication in a way that's never intended, people are going to figure it out. And so I think that cat is out of the bag.
Right. Actually, to stop on drug dealers for a second, because I had a debate maybe 6 months ago with a friend of mine, and we were just talking about how, like, he used to know people when he lived in New York that he would claim would be like these upstanding citizens otherwise, and they'd have good jobs, but then they would just deal like cocaine on the side or other sort of things. And so it was my point of thinking that, like, yeah, but this person is a net negative to society. That, like, the things that they're dealing and giving out, like, I'm sure it wasn't just cocaine, and not to mention, like, it continues to establish this underworld of where all the money goes to, and like you said, we don't know what these things are cut with. So even if they're selling weed or, let's say, MDMA or all these things, like, who knows where that is coming from and what it is being cut with? Are you seeing that as well? Like, is there such thing as a drug dealer that can get clean product and know that it's not contaminated with, like, the Xylazine or
there is. That's called the federal government,
right.
And that's called the state government, and so that's why we have these dispensaries. If you did two things, if you said, hey, we're going to, because it comes down to economics and incentives. So if you tell me what the incentive is, I'll tell you what the outcome is. So if the incentive is, hey, we're going to allow you to go to your local shop and buy fentanyl, heroin, cocaine, whatever it is, but we're going to regulate what's there, and we know that it's a safe product, that would certainly cut down. It would be harm reduction for the deaths. That's why in Europe they have places where people go shoot up, and they use heroin intravenously. And so that there's this concept of, if you're going to do this, we can regulate what you get, and then we're going to make money off of it as a government. So that's one concept, and that's I'm going to fix the supply. The better way to fix it, though, is fix the demand. Ask yourself, why are these people relying on this dopamine stimulation? Why are they demanding it? Because the demand is driving the drug dealer. If there was no demand for fentanyl, the drug dealers would go, well, I'm not going to spend time making this stuff. What do people want? Drug dealers are natural business people, so they're going.
But don't they also create the demand? Don't they create the demand by saying, like, try this insanely potent drug?
Yeah, but only with it. They actually lose the demand because they create this insanely potent drug, and a chunk of their people die. And so they're not doing that on purpose. They're not trying to kill anybody because that actually kills their customer. They're doing it inadvertently. Because they don't have the scientific background to create the right drug and the right mixture safely. Right. So that's an issue. And, you know, they don't have the best of ethics either. And so they don't really suffer the downstream expense of making a drug that's bad. So I think that you have to fix I think that as we demand things as consumers, somebody will provide the supply. And the more we demand as consumers, the more supply will become evident. So the question is, how do you change the demand? How do you change the desire of the person to demand this hedonic stimulation? And that's the key element. That's what we have to fix. And that's back to loneliness. I mean, that's the whole thing. People have a disconnection from society and from each other. And so they're using this hedonic stimulation, pulling it towards them, because they don't have any other connections left. Right. And so if we fix that demand, the supply will disappear.
And
the
you're
supply
saying
will
that
never disappear if we don't fix the demand.
Right. And you're saying that this Xylazine is about to be everywhere.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's all over. In Pittsburgh, it's in 90% plus of samples. Here in St. Louis, it's probably like 50 to 60% of samples. I would predict within 3 months it'll be in 90% of samples in St. Louis. I would
Wow.
predict that it will hit Europe very quickly. What it does is it extends the duration of the high. So fentanyl has a half life of minutes. You know, 10 minutes, 20 minutes. And so you have to dose again in 10, 20 minutes. You have to dose again in 10, 20 minutes. And so xylazine will extend that duration for a period of time, maybe to an hour. And so there's less frequency of dosing, and people go, oh, that's a better drug I got from this dealer. And so I'm going to go back to him. Well, inadvertently, he's not going to mix it right one time, and then all of a sudden you got 8 dead people. And so
Wow.
that's that xylazine and other compounds. I mean, there's, you know, these are entrepreneurs. These drug dealers are incredible entrepreneurs. They're trying to figure out how to make the most bang for that they can, how to make the most amount of money. And so they're going to constantly iterate till they find something that fulfills the needs of the population that's demanding the high.
Right. That will keep customers dependent and not deceased.
Yeah. Yeah, and hopefully not deceased, but they haven't figured that out with fentanyl. And so
Right. Well, eventually, if you keep someone not dependent, I'm sure they'll die by other means.
yeah, they will.
As their life completely collapses. So, wow, as depressing as that is, like I'm glad I'm at least aware of something like xylazine, because I didn't even know that was a thing, or how dangerous fentanyl was. That really, like, how powerful the aerosolized fentanyl is. I never would have thought that.
Yeah, it's incredibly powerful. You know, I actually did a position paper for an organization, explaining this to them 12 years ago. And I explained to them exactly the logistics of what was going to happen, how it was going to happen, and this weapon of mass destruction that was coming onto the borders. And, you know, it's one of the 3-letter agencies in the United States, and I did a position paper for them. And at first they thought, this can't be right. I'm like, nope, you're going to see it. It's just a matter of time.
Right.
Because I can tell you what the incentives are. And so, you know, what are the incentives? So there's something you have to keep in mind. Why is it that we have all this reagent being manufactured in China, and they don't tolerate drug abuse like we do here?
Mm-hmm.
Why isn't their own populations taking it? Well, there's no tolerance for it. They've got other substances that they can use, and it's a political machination. See, the thing is, they have not forgotten the first Opium War. The first Opium War was when the Brits fed the Chinese in the ports heroin. They transshipped heroin out of India and Afghanistan and brought it to the ports of China and made those people dependent upon it and addicted and demanded the ports be opened. That was the Opium War I. Now we have Opium War II, in which the Chinese are retaliating 100 plus years later and feeding our population their synthetic opium. And it's cavitating our population inside out. And, you know, in both situations, it was the demand of the people locally that wanted to consume the substance. And the supplier fulfilled it. But there's an overarching political aspiration. So if you look at TikTok in the United States versus TikTok in China,
Right.
TikTok in China is about education. It's about math quizzes. It's about science.
Right. And I think they've banned it. It's like I think once or twice a week, people under 18 can use it.
Yeah, they banned it for certain time periods so it doesn't distract them from their schoolwork and their academic performance.
Right.
And you're allowed to use it, but with limitations. And none of the content there is about, you know, guessing what gender you are or trying to figure out, like, how do I look more beautiful, or, you know, how
Those new
how do
filters are insane. Like I haven't downloaded TikTok. I'm staying away from it like it's fentanyl. But I really have friends of mine that are so obsessed with it, and girls will send me a video, and I'll be like, well, who's this? Who is this video of? And they're like, what do you mean that was me with the filter on? And they're getting so good that it's absurd. We're just like
Yeah,
we're just looking at ourselves until we die.
right. It's narcissus. It's a
Right.
concept of narcissism, and that's an inherent it's an inherent dopaminergic drive,
Hmm.
and so there's another study out that looked at TikTok and our ability to concentrate, our ability to hold mental space went from at one point, a couple minutes down to 30, 45 seconds, then down to 15 seconds. And now, as we've gotten more and more socialized into these TikTok videos, we're down to mental space, concentration, and holding concentration down to like between 7 and 9 seconds. Goldfish are better than us. And so this is a problem. And
Yeah.
so, as we've gotten to become a TikTok nation, and also the algorithms. The algorithms are just devastating, because we look for affirmation. Because we're lonely. We look for affirmation, and so the algorithms are driven in such a way that we're presented content that reinforces whatever it is that we're looking at. So if you look at a child and they use TikTok, within a few minutes, the algorithm drives them to whatever the deepest, darkest stupidity it could drive them toward. And pretty soon it starts presenting the algorithm of suicide to most children. And
Seriously?
the suicide yeah, this is well studied. And so because it recognized that this is a child and children are interested in unusual things, and suicide is an unusual thing, it's the algorithm drives them toward medicalization of things. It drives them toward bizarre things like TikTok tics, where people have, psychiatric illness because it's interesting. It holds people's attention. Well, inadvertently, it drives them towards suicide. It drives them towards video information about suicide, because it's not even whether they like it or dislike it. It's measuring how many seconds you're dwelling on that TikTok, and it makes a presumption that the more seconds that you dwell on your TikTok, that you like that content, whether you admitted you liked it or not. So if you're a male and you look at a scantily clad woman, just for 1 second longer than it thinks that normal people would look at it and we're not interested, then it starts presenting you an algorithm of more scantily clad women. And before you know it, it drives you toward people that are half naked, and then it drives you toward OnlyFans. It drives you toward the commercialization. And so it's measuring your attention span, and it knows that you only have attention for that one thing, because the way TikTok works, you're only being presented with one object. So it's measuring your duration of time, whether you've admitted you liked it or not.
It's so crazy. It's why I try to limit even my use to Instagram as well, which I do like. Like I have a feed that is mostly like, friends, mental health experts, mobility experts, strength training stuff. But if I go off of that for 1 second, like I can't even go look at a restaurant at a city I'm going to visit without seeing somebody show their ass or something. Like it's insane what we're doing in social media, and I think we're elevating these creators to the new kind of the czars of our attention. Whereas like these are the people that are getting all the likes and then they're getting sponsorship deals, and then they have more money to create more content, which people end up just following throughout the course of their careers or lives. So we're like, it's people that are dancing, creating all these ridiculous videos. Like, sure, some are funny, but like, what's the there's a book I've been meaning to read for ages. I think it was written 40 years ago, something like it called "I'm Using Ourselves to Death."
Yeah,
And,
that's exactly what's happening.
and
It's the
it,
dopamine
and
drive.
I don't know how we go back from this, because like I think I'd like to speak about some novel ideas for how to combat addiction that I'm sure you have to share. And I wonder if that can even be extrapolated into our addiction with social media and this TikTok, Instagram life that we've all created for ourselves, even if it's instant messaging with friends on, iMessage or WhatsApp. Like there's nonstop dopamine. Like how do we get back to producing things that are good for each other, for the world and society, and also just being more connected with each other. I think we're really on the cusp of like a really ugly sort of society we're forming.
Yeah, and that's the issue, and that's why I like Stoicism a little bit, because I think that there is a value to being a Stoic, saying, "Hey, I'm going to pull back from this because this is not for me, and I'm going to reflect on what I do." It's the concept of slow eating. It's the concept of a focus on an inward focus, and then understanding what's meaningful, and then a disconnection from these immediate dopamine releases. And so it's we really need to get to that, but there has to be a responsibility that occurs with parents to actually parent.
Right.
In the United States, we've got people that have, that are having children, and there's no adult in the room. So you've got people that, are 14 that are having babies, and their mom is, 28, and their grandma is 30 something, or 40. And you've got generations of people, and none of them had a parent because they were children raising children.
I would say the argument could be made of people that are even having kids at 25, late 20s. Like, does anyone that's I'm in my early 40s. Can anyone that's 40 say that knew what was going on in the world and their lives when they were in their 20s? I don't think so.
But we did have a situation where we had good parenting skills inherently, and we do inherently have those parenting skills, except something's gone wrong. So let's back up one step so that there's a bigger issue here. Let's say that I'm doing a rat study. I love rat studies, and I give the rats vegetable oil, and then I'm looking at their maternal bonding to the baby rat, because the baby rat needs care, and I measure a hormone called oxytocin, which is our bonding hormone. Do you know that if I feed rats vegetable oil, they don't produce oxytocin? And they lose their bonding hormone. And so as I feed these human rats more vegetable oil through food subsidies, they don't produce oxytocin. So they're no longer bonded to their children. And so they're not going to care for their child. They're not going to educate their child. And so we've created this. We've created this mischief for our population through the dietary means. So, I mean, we have to unwind that diet component, and we have to let people, we have to help educate them, so that they have good parenting skills.
Right. Yeah. It seems like there's like this 7-layer trifle of shit that we have to kind of undo before we get to a point that we can kind of get back to, it takes a village and all these things of people trying to be together instead of, it doesn't matter where we are. We're just,
I mean, we used to have people have kids when they were 14, and they raised perfectly fine kids, 15,000 years ago.
Right.
And so that it's not that they're young and they're having kids. It's that they're young and they're not able to, themselves are not educated. And so children having children because they never matured in the first place. So we have a lack of maturity because we didn't coach them in the right way.
Right. Yeah. And I want to be respectful of your time. I don't know, do you have to go, or do you have a time to discuss some novel treatments for addiction?
I've got to go because I've got to walk into something in about 3.5 minutes.
No, not a problem. I thank you very much for your time. It was really illuminating in a bunch of different ways, and then maybe down the road we can touch base and chat again.
Yeah, there's all kinds of. You're in Europe, and you're going to see what we're seeing, but you're going to see it later, and so learn from the lessons, the mistakes that we've made. You're going to see it. There's no doubt in my mind that it's just you're on the same trajectory. You're just behind a little bit because you have not been overwhelmed. Now, there are certain things that Europe has gotten right. Like they got rid of glyphosate. And glyphosate is a potent neurotoxin, and it's a potent, it's an herbicide, pesticide. It's an herbicide. And so it damages the mitochondria. And there's certain things that you guys are going to see that you're just a little bit behind on, but learn from those lessons and absorb those lessons so that hopefully, Europe stays a little bit better than we are here in the U.S. And now you've got other problems. I mean, there's a whole host of economic issues,
Right.
but that's a separate issue. But yeah, I mean, if you want to chat again, just hit me up and we'll kind of go through that. There's all kinds of simplicity in treatment that we just are missing. Like we totally miss things like light therapy. We totally miss things like sauna. We totally miss hormesis. We totally miss all kinds of other factors that have a major impact on health. And because they're not monetized, patients don't hear about them. Because there's no money involved for big ag or big government or for corporations, patients will never hear about them, and yet they're more powerful than most of the medications that we have.
Right. Wow. Well, it's a lot of food for thought. So thanks very much for joining me. I do appreciate your time and all your work in the medical field. So thanks for listening to No More, No Less. I appreciate the time you spent with me today. So please subscribe and rate the show if you enjoyed it. It'll help me create more amazing content and get that next little bit of validation that I so deeply crave. If you did enjoy it, well, that sucks. But to make sure, I think you should listen to my next 10 episodes and then decide. I mean, come on. Rome was not built in a day. I'm just getting warmed up here, guys. So thanks again. See you next time.